In the summer of 1827, a woman named Goliath's daughter wrapped her hands around her master's throat and squeezed until his body went limp. The wealthy plantation owner never saw it coming. But this wasn't just another tragic murder in the antebellum South. What happened in that mansion over the following weeks would defy every rational explanation, turning a crime scene into something far more sinister. The truth about what really happened that night has been buried for almost 2 centuries, until now. The town of Lexington, Kentucky looked pristine in the summer of 1827. White mansions dotted the rolling hills, their columns gleaming in the afternoon sun. Behind those elegant facades, a different reality existed. One that history books prefer to gloss over or ignore completely. Richard Thornton owned one of the largest estates in Fayette County. At 52 years old, he'd built his fortune on the backs of enslaved workers, like so many men of his time. But Thornton had a reputation that set him apart from other plantation owners. Former associates whispered about his cruelty. Local physicians refused to treat anyone from his property after witnessing the conditions there. Even other slaveholders, men who participated in the same brutal system, found Thornton excessive. Among the people Thornton enslaved was a woman known only as Goliath's daughter. Historical records never captured her given name. The only documents that mention her at all refer to her by her father's name, a man called Goliath who had died years earlier under circumstances that were never fully explained. She was approximately 28 years old in 1827, though exact birth records for enslaved people were rarely kept with any accuracy. Goliath's daughter worked in the main house, which meant she was under Thornton's direct supervision nearly every waking hour. The other enslaved workers on the property knew she bore the worst of his anger. Scars covered her arms and back. She walked with a slight limp from an injury that never healed properly. But something else set her apart too. The other workers claimed she had visions, dreams that came true, an ability to sense things before they happened. In the superstitious world of the 1820s South, these claims would have been dismissed as folklore by white society. But the people who lived and worked alongside her believed something different. They'd seen her predict a barn fire 3 days before it happened, watched her warn about a storm that meteorologists hadn't forecasted. These weren't party tricks or coincidences to them. They were survival tools in a world where knowledge meant the difference between life and death. The spring of 1827 brought an unusual cold snap to Kentucky. Frost killed early crops. Livestock fell sick. And Thornton's temperament, already volatile, became murderous. He increased work quotas despite the weather, cut rations. The violence escalated beyond even his normal standards. One evening in early June, Goliath's daughter was working in Thornton's study. She was cleaning his desk when he entered the room drunk. What happened next was documented in court records, though those records tell only part of the story. Thornton attacked her. Not for the first time, but this time something was different. According to the testimony given later, she fought back. For years, she'd endured his brutality, but on this particular night, something inside her snapped. Or perhaps something else took over entirely. The official account states that she strangled him with her bare hands, but the details in the coroner's report tell a more disturbing story. Thornton's neck showed evidence of crushing force that shouldn't have been possible from someone of her size and malnourished condition. His windpipe was completely collapsed. Several vertebrae were fractured. The doctor who examined the body noted in his report that the injuries were consistent with someone possessing extraordinary strength. Goliath's daughter didn't run. She didn't try to hide the body or cover up what happened. Instead, she walked calmly to the kitchen where 3 other enslaved workers were preparing the next day's meals. She told them what she'd done. Then she sat down at the table and waited. The workers faced an impossible choice. If they reported the murder, they knew the consequences. The legal system would execute her, probably torture her first to extract a confession. But it wouldn't stop there. White mobs often use such incidents as excuses for widespread violence against entire enslaved communities. Innocent people would die. So they made a different decision. They would hide the body and buy time to figure out what to do next. It was a desperate plan, but these were desperate circumstances. They wrapped Thornton's body in canvas and carried it to the root cellar beneath the kitchen. The space was cool and dark, used for storing vegetables and preserves. They placed him in the far corner and covered him with empty burlap sacks. Then they locked the cellar door and tried to act as if nothing had happened. For 3 days, the deception worked. When Thornton's business associates came calling, the house staff claimed he'd gone to Frankfurt on urgent business. When his brother stopped by, they said he'd left early that morning for Louisville. The lies bought time, but they couldn't last forever. And then the strange events began. On the 4th night after Thornton's death, the entire household was awakened by sounds coming from the root cellar. Heavy footsteps, the scrape of something being dragged across the floor. When the morning came, they found the cellar door standing open. The lock was still engaged, but somehow the door had been pulled open from the inside with enough force to tear the hinges partially out of the frame. The body was gone. What happened next depends on who's telling the story. The official version, the one that appeared in newspapers and court documents, claims that Thornton's body was discovered in the woods 3 miles from his property. A hunting party found it partially decomposed but still identifiable. The authorities arrested Goliath's daughter. The trial was brief. The outcome was never in doubt. But there's another version of events that was passed down through generations, preserved in oral histories and private journals that have only recently come to light. According to these accounts, Thornton's body didn't stay in the woods. It returned to the mansion. Night after night, household workers reported seeing him in the hallways. Not a ghost or a vision, but something solid, something that moved with purpose. His face showed the damage from strangulation, but his eyes were open, watching, waiting. The manifestation, if that's what it was, seemed drawn to Goliath's daughter specifically. She would wake to find him standing at the foot of her sleeping space. During the day, she'd catch glimpses of him watching her from doorways or windows. The other workers saw him too, which meant this wasn't a guilt-induced hallucination. Whatever was happening to all of them. The phenomena escalated. Objects in the house began moving on their own. Doors would slam shut with no wind to explain it. The temperature in certain rooms would plunge suddenly, leaving frost on the windows even in summer heat. And always, there was the sound of footsteps in the root cellar where Thornton's body had been hidden. One of the workers, a man named Samuel, kept a diary during this period. It wasn't discovered until the 1970s when the property was being excavated for a new development. His entries from June 1827 describe the situation in vivid detail. He wrote about waking one night to find all the furniture in the main house rearranged. Every chair, every table, every cabinet had been moved. Some pieces were stacked on top of each other in impossible configurations. The heavy grandfather clock from the entry hall was somehow placed on top of a wardrobe on the 2nd floor. Moving these objects would have required multiple strong workers and several hours of labor. Yet no one heard anything. No one saw anyone doing the work. Samuel's diary also mentions Goliath's daughter's state of mind during this time. She'd become eerily calm. While everyone else in the household was terrified, she seemed resigned to whatever was happening. She told Samuel that she'd seen this coming in her dreams for months, that she knew what the price would be for what she'd done. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. According to Samuel's account, Goliath's daughter claimed she didn't act alone the night she killed Thornton. She said something else had been in that room with them, an entity that had been following her since childhood. The same presence that gave her visions and premonitions. It had been waiting for the right moment, and Thornton's attack provided the opportunity it needed. She described it as a shadow that could take physical form when it chose to, something that existed between the world of the living and whatever comes after. It had offered her a bargain years earlier, protection and strength in exchange for something she didn't fully understand at the time. She'd accepted because the alternative was a lifetime of suffering with no hope of escape. Now the debt was coming due. The entity wanted Thornton's soul, but it wanted something else too. It wanted her, not just her life, but her complete surrender. to become a vessel for something that had been searching for a way into the physical world for a very long time. The other household workers tried to help her. They consulted with people in the community who understood things that existed outside conventional religion or science. Root workers, conjure women, people who maintained African spiritual practices despite the dangers of doing so in a society that viewed such beliefs as threatening. These practitioners examined the situation and delivered grave news. The entity had already claimed Thornton. What appeared to be his revenant was actually something else wearing his form, and it was using his body as an anchor to this world while it worked to take possession of Goliath's daughter completely. The solution they proposed was extreme. They would need to find Thornton's body, wherever it actually was, and destroy it completely. Fire would sever the entity's connection to the physical form it was manipulating, but doing so would also break the protection that had been keeping Goliath's daughter alive. The moment the entity lost its anchor, it would turn its full attention to claiming her as its new vessel. Time was running out. Thornton's associates were asking more questions. His brother had contacted the sheriff. Within days, maybe hours, authorities would search the property and discover the truth. The workers had to act. Samuel's diary describes what happened next in detail that's both specific and horrifying. They found Thornton's body in the woods where it had been discovered days earlier. But when they arrived, they realized the hunting party's report had been accurate in location but wrong about everything else. The body wasn't decomposing. It looked fresh, as if Thornton had died only hours before, and his eyes were open, tracking their movements as they approached. They'd brought oil and kindling. The plan was to build a pyre and burn the body completely, reducing it to ash that could be scattered. But the moment they tried to move Thornton's body, it animated. Not like a living person, but with jerking, unnatural movements. The thing inside him was fighting to maintain its foothold in the physical world. What followed was a violent struggle that left two of the workers seriously injured. But eventually, they managed to get the body onto the pyre. The flames caught quickly in the dry summer air. As the fire consumed Thornton's remains, everyone present heard screaming. Not from the body, which was far beyond making any sound, but from the air itself. A shriek of rage and loss that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Back at the mansion, Goliath's daughter collapsed. When she regained consciousness hours later, she was different. The calm acceptance was gone, replaced by raw terror. She knew the entity was coming for her now. The protection was broken. The debt had to be paid. The next 3 days were chaos. The manifestations intensified beyond anything the household had experienced before. Windows shattered spontaneously. Walls developed cracks that spread like spider webs. The temperature fluctuations became so extreme that ice formed on interior walls, while other rooms became unbearably hot. And through it all, Goliath's daughter was changing. Her eyes would go completely black for minutes at a time. She'd speak in voices that weren't her own, languages that no one recognized. Her body would contort in ways that should have broken bones. Whatever was trying to take possession of her was getting stronger. The workers tried everything they knew to help her. Protective symbols drawn in salt and ash. Prayers from multiple spiritual traditions. Physical restraints when the entity tried to make her harm herself or others. Nothing worked for long. They were fighting something that operated by rules they didn't fully understand. On the 7th day after Thornton's death, the sheriff arrived with a warrant to search the property. Thornton's brother had filed a missing person report. The house staff's stories weren't adding up. The authorities were going to find answers whether the household cooperated or not. Goliath's daughter was in the kitchen when they arrived. Samuel's diary says she looked directly at him before the sheriff entered the house. She mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Then she picked up a kitchen knife and walked outside to meet the authorities. What she told them was a partial truth. Yes, she had killed Richard Thornton. Yes, she had acted alone. Yes, she understood what she'd done and accepted the consequences. She gave them enough information to close their investigation while protecting everyone else in the household. She never mentioned the entity or the supernatural events. She knew they wouldn't believe her anyway. The trial lasted less than a day. The verdict was predetermined. She was sentenced to death by hanging, to be carried out within the week. Normally, such cases involved lengthy torture to extract confessions or information about accomplices. But something about her unnerved the authorities. They wanted this over quickly. Her execution was scheduled for dawn on June 30th, 1827. A crowd gathered to witness it, as crowds always did for such events. But according to multiple accounts from different sources, including the local newspaper's report, something unusual happened. When they placed the noose around her neck, Goliath's daughter began to speak, not in English, but in a language that sounded ancient and wrong. The words seemed to vibrate in the air. Several people in the crowd became violently ill. Others reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The executioner didn't wait for her to finish. He released the trap door. Her body dropped. The rope snapped taut. And then something impossible happened. The rope broke. Not frayed or worn through, but snapped cleanly as if cut with a blade. Goliath's daughter fell to the ground. She should have been dead from a broken neck, but she stood up. The crowd panicked. Some ran. Others stood frozen in shock. The guards moved to restrain her, but she didn't resist. Instead, she looked up at the sky and smiled. Then she spoke in her own voice, clear and calm. "It's done." She collapsed a moment later. This time she didn't get up. The doctor confirmed she was dead. No pulse, no breathing. Her body showed the bruising and trauma consistent with a hanging. But witnesses swore they'd seen her standing after the rope broke. They saw her move and speak on her own. The authorities buried her in an unmarked grave on the edge of the property. They wanted no memorial, no marker that might draw attention or sympathy. As far as they were concerned, the case was closed. Justice had been served. But the story didn't end there. The workers who had lived through those 2 weeks never spoke publicly about what they'd experienced, but they passed the story down through their families, and other strange details emerged over time. The mansion where Thornton lived was abandoned after his death. His family couldn't find anyone willing to work or live there. Multiple attempts were made to sell the property, but every potential buyer backed out after spending a night in the house. By 1835, the building stood empty. In 1842, the mansion burned to the ground. The fire started in the root cellar where Thornton's body had been hidden. No cause was ever determined. Some witnesses reported seeing a woman standing in the flames, but when firefighters searched the ruins, they found no remains. The land itself seemed cursed. Every structure built on that site met a similar fate: fires, collapses, mysterious accidents. By the early 1900s, people simply stopped trying. The property was eventually absorbed into a public park. The dark history largely forgotten. But there's one final detail that deserves attention. In 1968, during construction of a new visitor center for the park, workers discovered something buried about 6 feet deep. A small wooden box preserved by the clay soil. Inside were personal items, a few pieces of jewelry, some fabric scraps, and a journal. The journal belonged to a woman who identified herself only as G's daughter. The entries dated from 1820 to 1827. Most of it described daily life in mundane detail. But the final entries, written in the weeks before Thornton's death, told a different story. She wrote about dreams that became more vivid and disturbing as time went on. About a presence that had been with her since childhood, something she'd initially thought was an imaginary friend or guardian spirit. She wrote about the bargains she'd made, not fully understanding what she was agreeing to. And she wrote about the growing realization that the entity wasn't protecting her at all. It was using her, preparing her. The final entry, dated June 23, 1827, consisted of only one line: "Tonight I take back what's mine, even if it costs everything." The journal was turned over to local historical societies, but it was never put on public display. Too controversial, too strange. It sits now in a climate-controlled archive, available only to researchers who specifically request it. Most historians dismiss it as either a fraud or the ravings of someone suffering from extreme trauma. But the people who've read it in person, who've held those pages that were written almost 2 centuries ago, say there's something wrong about it. The ink seems to move when you're not looking directly at it. The pages feel warm to the touch, even in the cool archive storage. And some report dreaming about Goliath's daughter after reading her words. Vivid dreams where she's trying to tell them something they can't quite understand. The land where Thornton's mansion stood remains empty to this day. Just forest and overgrown foundations. But locals still report strange sightings there. A woman's figure standing among the trees. The sound of footsteps when no one's around. And sometimes, on quiet summer nights, the smell of smoke, as if something is still burning.